So, welcome, Christopher Ruocchio, to the Nostalgic Dragon. I'm happy that you are here with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
And for those who you don't know, and Christopher will present himself, he's the author of the SUNEATER series. That's the book I have here in the shelf. It's the first book, Empire of Silence. I have just finished the book this Monday. I really like your book, and I will review it later for those watching the channel. First, I think it's interesting just to have a conversation with you, Christopher, about the book and how come I started to read your book. It's because of this channel, because there was one subscriber who advised me to read your book.
Oh, well, thank them for me.
Yeah, and
No, that's great.
he or she is probably watching, I'm quite sure. So
Yeah, well, hello, whoever you may be. No, that's awesome. I really appreciate, the word of mouth is really the best marketing that any author can have, and I've been very blessed to have BookTube support, especially in the last couple of years. It's really sort of made this possible. It's now not just my day job, but my wife is able to stay at home, and that's really thanks to BookTube. So I'm very grateful to anybody who helps get my name out there, get the books out there. But as you said, for those who don't know, my name is Christopher Ruocchio. I'm the author of the SUNEATER science fantasy series, I like to say, because it's got a little bit of both in it. And I've written 6 books now, all in that series, as well as 3 novellas and about 24 short stories, all of which, with one exception, are in the same setting. And I also very briefly wrote for Marvel Comics. I did one Thor story, and that was quite fun as well. But I've been doing this now for 6 years professionally as a writer, but I also worked in publishing and was an editor at Baen Books for about 7 years. I started as an unpaid intern in college, and I left as junior editor in order to go and do this full time. So that's me.
wow. Your background is very interesting, I think. And some of you who watch my channel knows that I'm focusing sometimes on fantasy and Malazan and mythology, different kind of epics. Here's gods and goddesses in ancient mythology. It's Swedish, so difficult for you to see. And there's a Hindu epic here. Um, so I also read some science fiction. So I'm quite new to science fiction, actually.
Mhm.
This is not something I used to read. I've read Ursula K. Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness, if I remember it correctly, and
Yep.
also Dune, of course, I've read, but very, very recently. And so actually, I would say your book is my first real space opera. So it's a exciting adventure. Is it possible for you to just summarize this will be spoiler free. So if you're watching, that's important to know. But I'm interested, you, Christopher, to just summarize what's this series about?
Yeah, so the Sun Eater is a space opera that's set about 20,000 years in our future, not a galaxy far, far away. That being said, it's very much in the tradition of something like Star Wars or Dune. It's very much in conversation with Dune. That was a very conscious choice on my part. But it's set in a galactic empire, as I say, far in our future. And it's the story of a man named Hadrian Marlowe, who's a nobleman who grows up in this empire. And he runs away from home and finds himself caught in the middle of a war between said empire and an alien species called the Cielson, who are the only species in all of that future history that ever really posed a threat to humanity. And he tells you on page 1, it's written like a memoir, that he's the man who ended that war and dealt with the Cielson. His story is why and how, and about all the things that didn't make it into the official history. So this is his personal account of the war and his role in it, written after its end. And so we start by telling you it's over. I'm responsible for its being over, and we go from there.
Hmm. I think that's a great setup. It's not new to me, but I don't used to read books that have that kind of setup where you know where it's heading. You could
Yeah.
see it makes it very interesting to, how did it happen? So I'm just starting my journey as you know. Um, One thing I have to say before we get into it is that today we're going to explore some of your writing style or techniques, and we're going to talk about your inspiration for your writing. And also there are themes in the book, which we'll come back to, that we will talk about. And that has to do with, for example, identity and class, spirituality and faith, and language. But first of all, I would like to ask you about your writing style, because even if you only read one page of Empire of Silence, the first book, or 2 pages, you will notice that I think your language flows very natural. And that is not a critique against other authors, because if you read mythology, for example, like the Iliad, I don't think the language flows, for example. You have to practice to read that, and then maybe it flows later when you know the rhythm. But I think you have a special kind of style, makes it easy, very relaxing, very meditative. I don't know if you can elaborate something about how you write and your thoughts about your writing style.
Yeah, I actually think I have a pretty direct answer for this one. I write out loud, which is quite embarrassing if people catch me doing it. But I sort of vocalize everything relatively quietly. It's sort of like watching Gollum talk to himself at my desk. But I grew up listening to audiobooks a lot. I was a really early adopter on audiobooks. I had the Lord of the Rings complete CD set growing up, because I got really into The Hobbit. I was reading very early. I was reading like at 3, 4. I remember getting the first Harry Potter book when it came out, and I wasn't even in kindergarten yet. But I made the jump to The Hobbit because the movies were starting to come out around the turn of the millennium, and so they were everywhere. And it was sort of a natural next step after getting into Harry Potter as a small child. And so The Hobbit was fine, but then trying to make the jump to Lord of the Rings was a bit of a stretch. I must have been 7 or 8 when the movie started to come out, because it's a much more complicated book stylistically and just in terms of its scale, right? It's a much longer book, and so I burned out reading Lord of the Rings with my eyes. And my parents got me the CDs. Actually, they got me the BBC radio dramas by mistake at first, and I was like, I'm not sure this is a book, Mom and Dad. And then I learned what abridged meant, and I was horrified, and we got the proper ones eventually. But because I owned those on CD, I ended up going through them over and over and over and over again. I would fall asleep listening to Tolkien for like 10 years. They were the only audiobooks I really owned. My parents owned the Harry Potter ones, but those were mine. Lord of the Rings were mine, and I destroyed the CDs. The cases were all falling apart. The CDs were starting to get scratchy and not working, and I didn't. They were so expensive. I didn't get a lot of others. And so I've been through Tolkien something like 80 or 90 times in my life. I eventually moved on, obviously. I listened to, I got into Dune in middle school, and then from there I really became a science fiction guy. But I've always had this very strong relationship with the written word as spoken. And of course, we used to read out loud almost all the time as a culture. Reading silently was sort of a strange thing. There are stories about Julius Caesar reading silently to like spook people because it was so weird. Um, and so I have the sense that good prose must sound good. And so if I say anything that sounds bad as I'm writing, I don't write it. And so I listen very closely, especially to dialogue, because bad dialogue sounds bad. It doesn't sound like a person speaking. And so I listen to everything that I write as I write, and then I go back and I reread things. And that's sort of the most crucial bit of writing advice I can ever give anybody is read what you've written to an audience if you can get it. You shouldn't just sit here and sort of mumble through it as fast as you can. You should read like someone is listening, because you'll really hear your mistakes in those circumstances. And that is something I've taken very seriously, and more seriously as my career has gone on. I've really tried to focus on the sound and the pacing of language, because your ear connects to a different part of your brain than the part that's doing the writing. And so it's almost like having someone check your work for you, because you're using different parts of your brain and you're engaging with the text almost in a more holistic way than if you're just sitting there tapping away at the keyboard, which is a very, I think, disembodied process, and sort of being more present with the text as you're creating it, but also as you're reading it. This is one of the things I know it's getting very popular for people to read along and listen to the audiobook at the same time, and they're sort of really immersing themselves in the text. And I think that's great. And I think I think that movement is broadly analogous to my own writing process in a certain way.
Yeah, for you who haven't read it or just started, for me, when I read your book, it was, like a great feeling to sit down in the couch and read your text, because it felt atmospheric, and like I very easy got into the science fiction setting. And so I think that it's great to read your prose, actually. So I was
Well,
surprised
thank you.
because, but maybe that's because I'm reading sometimes prose that is more not so natural, I would say. So I was a bit surprised. So I've read, I don't want to compare authors. I think every author is worth respect because it's not easy to write a book. I'm reading The Name of the Wind a little bit now, and that's of course very good prose as well. And but still, I find I was thinking about that this morning when I read it. I found your prose more fluent, I would say, so more waterfally.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. My book gets compared to that one rather frequently, I think, for having the same sort of memoir conceit, and because I had the same publisher here, have the same publisher here in the U.S. My editor pushed me very hard on the first book to try and bring those books together in the hopes of getting some crossover attention. I think I've largely paid a price for that because comparison, it turns out, is not great for authors. It's not actually the marketing tool I think the publishers sometimes think it is. It can often be really an albatross around a writer's neck to get compared to somebody else. But it was that was the publisher's move. And but I at the same time, of course, honored to be compared. That's very well loved fantasy book, and to be in the same sentence is quite nice. So it was a bit of a double-edged sword, I guess, is what I'm saying. But
Yeah, I can guess. Yeah, interesting to hear about your writing style, and you talked a bit about Tolkien here, but inspiration. But my question is about your inspiration for writing the SUNEATER series. So not just inspiration for writing, but what inspired you to, sit down, take the pen or the computer and start to write
yeah,
this SUNEATER.
it's very hard for me to say. There were writers. Robert E. Howard said that he had this sort of like moment where he had this complete vision of who Conan was, and Conan sort of walked up to him and said, Howard of Texas, you must write my story. And I can't point to a single episode like that. I knew from a very early age, 5, 6, that I wanted to write, and I started seriously trying. I'd say probably 8 or 9, and I've been writing my entire life. I've always wanted to do this. This was the only job I ever seriously entertained wanting to have. I sort of figured if I was gonna need to get another job to make writing happen, that was fine, but this was the goal. And I usually advise people, not to do that and to focus on the backup plan, because sticking this landing is very unlikely. As I say, I feel very blessed to be able to do this. But it makes it hard to say exactly where even the SUNEATER started, because I was always working on something. And when I was a kid, I was writing something that was a lot more fantasy. I was reading a lot more fantasy as a kid. I was also playing a lot of fantasy games. This is a thing we talk about literary references and inspirations all the time. But I am still a great lover of video games, and so I was greatly influenced by like Japanese role-playing games. Not so much Final Fantasy, but things like the Tales series and some other games. Lost Odyssey springs to mind. That was a masterpiece on the Xbox 360. So I had this sort of binary thread of literary inputs and sort of multimedia inputs, because it's of course film as well. Star Wars, I think, really was what made me fall in love with science fiction as a kid. My dad had the laser discs of the original movies, so I got to see the non-special edition versions of the original trilogy. I grew up with those, and my parents were very restrictive about what movies and television I was allowed to watch as a kid. I was the oldest child, but Star Wars was fine because they knew Star Wars and they liked Star Wars. So I'm much the same way that I cycled through the Lord of the Rings because it was the only CDs that I had. I watched Star Wars incessantly for years as a kid, just over and over, and it sort of eventually formed this I guess bedrock in my head of science fiction and fantasy, and I kind of went from there. The first science fiction books I was reading were Star Wars books, and then I branched out into proper, let's say, proper science fiction, not media tie-in books. And so SUNEATER's formation was really like an agglomerative process. It really grew out of my love affair with fantasy, with science fiction over the course of my entire life. It's sort of a kitchen sink project. Every idea that I've ever had about a story that I wanted to tell that could fit into this one framework has gone into it. And so SUNEATER is, because we all do this, right? We read a book and we say that was great, but it gave me this idea. If the author had maybe gone this way instead, I might have liked that better. And it turns out if you get like 10,000 of those, you have a story. And SUNEATER sort of emerged from all of those right turns when the author went left and vice versa. But there's no clear point where I said, here it is. Because I would write earlier versions that were maybe 5% similar and then 10% similar, and then eventually it became Empire of Silence. And it only really became Empire of Silence after it was sold. It was a very different book that I sold to my publisher back in 2016. It was half as long. Valka wasn't in it at all. It was quite a different novel. And so it's been a slow process. Tolkien said Lord of the Rings grew in the telling, and I can really say the same in this case.
So it has evolved during time.
Yeah, and still is. I'm not, I'm not finished with it.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
So,
And that's interesting for me and hopefully the viewers as well, because I usually read things that are done. I mean, it's the same with music I listen to or video games I buy. I also play video games from time to time.
Cool.
So I thought it was cool to, follow you and to start the series since it was not finished, and follow your development as an author as well. One thing I have thought about is the so it grow. You have talked about your writing style, and from what you tell me, it's a bit of a, now I say, like oral tradition, like maybe it's not writing. Writing is one thing, and then you can tell stories. So when you talk about this, you feel like a storyteller who's talking in front of a fire.
Yeah, it's a very slow back and forth process though, right? Because I'm still writing, with a keyboard in a Word document, but I am like, sounding out the sentences as I go and saying, not quite, and then I'll try to re-say a sentence, and I'll make sure, I'm always sub-vocalizing as I'm writing, and listening to make sure the sentence doesn't sound silly or stilted or anything like that. So it's not like I'm just dictating. I know writers who do literally dictate their novels. I know Kevin J. Anderson goes on hikes in the mountains. He lives in Colorado, and he literally speaks into a tape recorder, and I think he still uses a tape recorder. And then has someone transcribe it later. I'm still actually writing, but it is it's a very slow sort of back and forth process where I'm checking everything as I go, speaking it out loud. And then and instead of really formally reciting or anything like that.
Was there a shift, because you mentioned fantasy in the beginning, and then now you're writing science fiction? Did you intend to write science fiction, or were you more into fantasy? And if you were, what made you shift? Maybe the difference is so big. I don't know.
Yeah, no, so to me, really, I don't know that there is a great difference between the genres. I think science fiction is still deeply mythological. I think it's largely a mythology for our sort of post-religious climate. I think most science fiction writers historically have been in some manner of agnostic. And so I think that the mythology about outer space that we all have, right? Like, 'cause we could be completely wrong about it. It's, we still haven't found anything out there, right? But these ideas we have about extraterrestrial life and general relativity and things may not be 100% correct, right? And so these are like, there's not really a great difference between a Vulcan and an elf, right? Like symbolically in terms of their literary role, right? They're human-ish, but like above us in a certain way, right? They kind of occupy a similar symbolic mythological niche. And so I broadly think that science fiction is just another kind of mythological storytelling, but for a different culture. And this is partly why I think of SUNEATER as science fantasy, because I have this approach to science fiction generally. I don't think it's symbolically that different. And so when exactly I changed my mind and decided I would start calling what I was doing science fiction and decided I wanted spaceships, I'm not sure, because it must have been sometime in high school I really shifted. And I think that was largely a consequence of my reading more science fiction novels at the time. I had I went to a high school that had a lot of elective courses you could sign up for, and one of them was a science fiction literature course, and it was taught by an older fellow who had been like a Worldcon attendee for decades and had read all these books, and so I had this real crash course in all these writers that most readers my age are not familiar with, writers like A. E. Van Vogt and C.L. Moore and Lee Brackett, and so very often when I talk to science fiction fans, I'm like at right angles with them because they haven't read any Poe Anderson or Jack Vance or something. And I find myself a lot more simpatico with people who are maybe my father's generation or older in terms of the books they're familiar with or grew up reading because of this class that I had. And I think that class probably is what moved the needle for me away from fantasy, because before that I'd basically, if I was reading science fiction, it was Star Wars, and I'd just gotten into Dune because I had a friend who was interested in it in middle school, and which would have been about age 13, 14. I know the school system's different in Europe. So before that it had been mostly fantasy, and I think that class is what moved the needle, and it was sometime around then that I started to consider doing a science fiction novel instead. But I always kept, I think, the basic sort of sense of a fantasy writer. I think that SUNEATER is very stylistically accessible if you're used to reading fantasy. Science fiction has this, I think, impression outside of being harder than fantasy, more difficult to get into, less character driven. And I wanted to bring sort of the fantasy fan sensibility to science fiction and to write this this sort of epic that format wise maybe is more appropriately set in a fantasy world, but I wanted to do that in a science fictional setting. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it's maybe for me a good bridge to start to read science fiction or science fantasy. I have a cup here actually, or a mug, maybe you say cup. I'm not sure. Maybe you recognize this. I'm not sure. This is a bit of criticized video game though. This is Starfield.
Oh,
No
Starfield,
commercial,
yeah.
but I'm playing the game, and I bought the game because I read your book, and since I'm not so, I mean, I've seen Star Wars, of course, and seen Blade Runner and so on, so Interstellar or movies,
Yeah, yeah.
but I don't have the language or the pictures in my head for science fiction as I have with fantasy. It's very obvious for me how a armor looks like, how a battle looks like, or a castle looks like, etc., or magic
Yeah.
looks like. So I thought I'll buy this game. I read a lot about critique about the game, so I get some pictures just to. You describe it so well in your book, but I also wanted to see it on picture. So I want to talk a bit about the setting, the sci-fi setting, because that's really one thing I like. I mean, this is Sweden now. It's still it's late summer, so but the evenings are getting darker. It's very bright here in in June, July. So sun is up to 11 o'clock in the evening. Now it's getting darker, so then to take your book and to really sink into all these sci-fi lights and starships, it's very nice. I think I feel comfortable in that environment. But how do you how do you create the sci-fi setting when you write? Because I know you also seen the movies and Star Wars and things, but how do you do to immerse yourself in that world to be able to transfer it to your readers?
Yeah, so you make an interesting point, right? Which is that the sort of visual grammar of fantasy is very well established because it's grounded largely in our own history, right? And even when it's not, right, the sort of basic kind of Tolkien tropes of fantasy, elves, dwarves, right, um, which of course have their roots in Germanic mythology, right, but have become something else to a large extent because they've been telephoned through things like Dungeons and Dragons and really boiled down to this sort of basic tropic language. Science fiction doesn't have that, right? Largely because if you had the same aliens showing up all the time in science fiction novels, it would be kind of weird because aliens are usually individually created species by authors for individual projects. There's no elf for science fiction, right? I mean, robots maybe, right? But even there's a lot of variety. Science fiction doesn't have a shared grammar quite to the extent that fantasy does, and even with because at the very least, right, fantasy has knights and castles largely, right, or some other historical analogy, right, depending on what period of history. Because the game we play with fantasy is I picked a historical period, I made a Middle Earth out of it, and and here's my book, right? We sort of take a moment in our own past and translate it to a fantasy setting and weave in the mythology from that culture and go. Science fiction is a lot more uh, open because it would be strange if an alien species was actually like I don't know Russians, right? Like that would be unusual.
Yeah.
And so we obviously do a bit of that. It's impossible in creating an alien species, as Descartes noted about imaginary creatures, right? Without basing it on things that we already know about. We're not God. We can't create something purely original. We have to build it on stuff that we know. But um, uh, I wanted to make it a little bit easier because the science fiction I don't enjoy is science fiction that has like no people in it. Either because the author doesn't really write about characters so much, they write about these like big broad things that are happening to civilization, or because they write about post-humans who are so unrecognizable in their like emotional chemistry or cultural mores that I can't relate to them. Um, and there are exceptions. I like Ian Banks a lot, and one of my favorite of his books is Succession. And that's basically just all about AI. There are almost no humans in that book, but Banks is delightful. In any case, I wanted to create a future that was recognizably human. Um, uh, I don't want to say for cynical marketing reasons, but because it would be more accessible to readers. Fantasy is a much more popular and successful genre than science fiction. Science fiction is a much smaller pond relative to the ocean that is fantasy, and I largely think that's down to this grammar we're talking about, right? This sort of accessibility of fantasy tropes, and so I thought about that a lot, and I wanted to make a future that was very much grounded in our past. And so the setting for SUNEATER is this galactic empire that is very self-consciously in universe grounded upon the civilizations of humanity. An influence to them, a lot of Greek influence. I have a classics background, so it sort of
Yeah.
came naturally. But you also see Western civilizations have done this like throughout their entire history. I mean, the government buildings in Washington D.C. are all self-consciously Greco-Roman, right? The British went through a phase as well. In the Georgian period where they were, and Victorian period where they were building all these neoclassical buildings. And so there's always this attempt to say, actually, we are the inheritors of Rome, right? It's us, it's us, it's us, because that grants you the sort of legitimacy, the sort of mandate of heaven almost. It's like we're actually civilization, like the Romans were civilization. And so there's no reason I see why that process should stop in 2024. I see no reason future civilizations wouldn't dress up the way that we do. You look at the House of Representatives in Washington, and they have the Roman fasces is on the wall, right behind them. The axe made out of all the sticks the lictors used to carry, and obviously the American eagle is a direct descendant of the Roman one, right? So we keep up this language, and so the Salian Empire in SUNEATER does this, but they do this in an age where Earth is gone, and Earth's all of Earth's cultures basically are extinct in their original forms, a couple exceptions. And so they see themselves not as the inheritors of any particular culture, but of every culture. And so there are elements of basically everything I've ever heard of woven into the Sullan Empire's cultural framework. Their justice system is very legalistic in sort of the Chinese way, in terms of corporal punishment and things like that. Very much Qing Dynasty, for example. Their religion is broadly a kind of sort of neo-paganism that sort of borrows on the Roman model, but has influences from Hinduism, for example, and from all over the world. And so basically they've created and when they created it, it was very artificial. It was very self-conscious. We've defeated the robots. We're going to embrace our humanity fully. What does that look like, right? And they build this artificial society, but it's gone on for so long that it's sincerely held by basically everybody in the empire, except for a few well-read cynics who know that it was done on purpose. And sort of the result of this, though, I think, is a universe that feels very familiar to readers, because this is not a space opera where you don't recognize or can't pronounce the names of things. Like people have names that are recognizable to names today, particularly the aristocrats. They're keeping a lot of the old names alive. And you can point to sort of mythological figures like Alexander the Great and King Arthur, and that are still sort of celebrated and are still part of the cultural memory of this humanity. Because I don't agree. A lot of science fiction writers are like, we're going to throw all that away. We don't need it. And I think that's unlikely, but I also think it's a grave mistake. I think that our sort of collective cultural patrimony as a species is a very beautiful and, if messy and complicated thing. And I see no reason to throw any of the old stories away. I think they're all fascinating and marvelous. And so I wanted a future, however non-utopian it may be, that embraced all of that messiness.
That was something I really appreciated, because in fantasy, usually I appreciate that as well, but there are made up pantheons. You understand that it's related to some religion or faith or mythology on Earth, but they have different names, for example, and different rituals. But when I read The Empire of Silence, I recognize, as you say, things from Greek and ancient Europe, or ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and other parts of the world. You mentioned India, for example. You can recognize a lot of things. I appreciate that, and also names and the stories that I recognize as a human being living on Earth. It felt for me like I got a better connection to the book and to the stories and to the book's lore, I would say.
Yeah, there's something. I am friendly with Tim Powers, the fantasy writer, and Tim writes these. He calls them secret history books, where he gets very interested in a period of history, whether that's the British Regency, right, or the 1960s or whatever, and then he reads about it until he comes up with a fantasy story and sort of slides it into the historical record without breaking any of the established historical histories, right? And people when they interview him and they say, "Hey, this is a fantasy book that's set in a version of the 1810s that has vampires," and he says, no, it's set in 1810 and there are vampires, right? Like, it's not a different world, it's our world, right? And in a certain sense too, the argument, the idea here is, this is our future, right? It's not it's not a galaxy far, far away, right? You'll say again, right? It's the opposite of Star Wars in a certain sense, because it's not this sort of other world that's sort of divorced from our cultural concerns and all this stuff. Now, this is very common in science fiction, right? We're always projecting, some kind of future for ourselves. But a lot of science fiction writers, I think, shy away from religion specifically, but they shy away from too much connectedness to now, because I don't know exactly why they do this, but there are a lot of futures. I'm always troubled by Star Trek's complete lack of religion. I wonder when exactly my descendants got killed, and so it's not a future that I find very plausible, because the humanity in it is very different than the humanity that I know.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to do something that felt more true to how I think a future that is still human, recognizably, might look. Of course, we might replace ourselves, with robots or something. But if we don't, I hope that I've created a future that's not too implausible in a certain sense.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting to listen to. And I would like to talk a bit about Hadrian. I think this because Hadrian, to me, he is. I can understand him. He's very human, and I think many of the. I'm surprised, without spoiling anything, he makes a lot of choices, and sometimes I'm very surprised by the choices he makes. But he feels, he has a reptile brain, and sometimes he's rational, sometimes he's not. I think it's a good way to describe a main character, not so heroic always. One thing that he does, which I don't think is a spoiler, is that he explores, I would say, or maybe you, through your writing the book, identity and maybe class. I'm not sure about that, because class is, I'm not sure about US, but it talks a lot in Europe. We talk a lot about class or class. I'm not sure about in the US, but still, that's what I feel. He moves between these different segments of the society. He has an idea about who he is. He's a noble. He's from
Yeah.
the nobility. So I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit on his journey without spoiling too much, but he's obviously searching for himself, and maybe something, and also his identity, who he is.
Yeah, Hadrian is, as you mentioned, he makes some very silly decisions at some points in the book. He's about 20 years old, and having been about 20 when I was writing it, I was painfully aware of how stupid I could be. And so I wanted to get away from a protagonist who just did everything correctly all the time. That was a very self-conscious sort of decision, because 20-year-olds who do everything correctly all the time almost don't exist. And so I wanted to make sure that he not just made mistakes, but made completely inscrutable, goofy decisions, because his brain's not there yet. As mine wasn't at the time. And I've always been maybe cartoonishly self-conscious. So that was sort of the impetus behind that. But as far as his exploration of his place in the universe, let's say, class is certainly part of it. Americans like to pretend that we don't have class, because the idea of our revolution was that we were getting rid of it. But of course, there are always people who have more status and place and things than other people. So we have it, even though we pretend it's not a thing. But in any case, Hadrian, he's trying to figure out where he belongs, because he's a person also with a very strong moral compass. It doesn't quite always point north, but he's the sort of person who, whichever way it's pointing, he's pretty sure it's north, right? And so he'll do his best. Sometimes he misses a little bit, especially as he's younger. He gets, I think, more accurate, let's say, as he gets older, in finding wherever north actually is and what north means in this metaphor. But he does his best. He is very impulsive, but that's because he's got this very strong sense of justice, and he recognizes that the circumstances in which he exists are not just. And but at the same time, he doesn't really know what to do about that, because we have this fantasy we play out in a lot of the speculative fiction of, like, the one person being able to completely change the shape of the world and interrogate systems of inherited power and all sorts of Zen-like phrases that people like to say. And reality isn't like that. Very often you have to negotiate a place for yourself in the world rather than break the world to fit you. And Hadrian is someone who tries to do that. He wants very much to be he wants to be Captain Kirk, right? Actually, he really wants to be Spock. He wants to be the scientific advisor on a ship that's exploring strange new worlds. But he, let's say, instead gets to be Darth Vader. And that is not the role that he wants. But he has to like find a way to make that work as the series goes on, and to figure out what someone with his moral compass can be and can do in the position that he finds himself. Because that's, I think, really what growing up looks like. It's not like you get to pick your future; you get to negotiate your future, right? And so he goes sort of all over the place. He spends time as basically a slave and as a gladiator. This is my Roman background talking, right? And then he goes back up the ladder and then back down it, but he never quite fits. Heroes mythologically are always very liminal figures, right? Usually they have some sort of strange, like, Gilgamesh is a third god and 2/3 man, right? And so he doesn't quite fit even in his kingship, right? Doesn't quite belong. You see this in all sorts of characters, right? And so many Greek heroes are demigods, right? They have this sort of weird liminal position. And Hadrian is also like this weird spot because he's an aristocrat, but he really hates being an aristocrat. But he's willing to be one if it's useful. And so he's constantly negotiating his social roles, right? He tries to be a regular guy to the regular guys that he knows, right? But he also has to flex that aristocratic muscle in certain circumstances, and he tries to put on the right face for the right circumstances while at the same time being true to whatever the core of himself is, right? And so he's a person who's constantly pulled in all these different directions, and is trying to hold himself together despite that. Hopefully that sort of doesn't spoil anything.
No, I don't think so. From a personal point of view, I will talk more about that on my channel, so I won't delve into it now. My own personal journey is not like Hadrian's, though, but I've done different things, of course, and not followed what has been expected, and also, of course, thought about my identity and who I am. So I felt a bit connected to Hadrian, even though my story is not so dramatic as Hadrian's seemed to be.
Yeah, well, Hadrian is very dramatic.
Yeah.
The thing about characters always make fun of him for being very, very dramatic, and the thing about that is that I am, and we live in so ironic a time. Most of my generation are unable to really handle direct authenticity. Millennials are very big on irony. And so I had to sort of make fun of him or the book wouldn't be taken seriously. I needed someone in the book to mock his melodramatic style, which is my melodramatic style. Otherwise it wouldn't have worked. Because in my regular life, I think I'm a very serious person, despite how it may seem. And so my instinct is to be very dramatic in writing these books and to make characters that are very, very larger than life. And that doesn't work for everybody. So someone has to be there to take the air out of Hadrian's head with a needle every now and then. So so there's a bit of that element as well.
Yeah, but I think it feels very human, and I suppose every human has been in search for him or herself. So I think the story can connect to a lot of people. One thing, I will switch subject a bit now. So
Yeah.
from identity and class, I would like actually to talk a bit about the language actually, because I'll show those who haven't seen it. If you open the Empire of Silence, so this is things
Yeah.
trigger me. I'm get happy. So you see this. I won't spoil this, but you see letters of some kind.
Yeah.
And
Yes. Yeah.
you have in your book, there's a lot of languages, and Adrian talks a lot of languages, and you also refer in your writing in conversations, for example, how they use their language. If it's neuter or masculine or feminine, or if it's maybe that has to do with class, but how they which titles they use. So language is very important for the book and his journey actually later on in the story, which tasks he gets later on. So I was just curious about your language interest in relation to SUNEATER and why. Maybe I'm wrong. You can just say if you think I'm have a wrong interpretation. But for me, language takes a big part of the story. It's a way of for you to tell the story, to use the languages in the book.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. This is the Tolkien influence showing, right? I A lot of fantasy science fiction writers, especially people who want to be fantasy science fiction writers, feel that they have to emulate Tolkien in this department, right? And you don't, but I wanted to. I love languages. I'm very bad at learning them, to speak them, that is, but I'm very interested in how they work. And so I have a mostly functional alien language in the series, for the Cielson, the principal antagonists. It's based on Latin and Japanese, which are the two languages I know best besides English. I'm not orally fluent in either of them. I used to be able to translate whole Latin texts, but I haven't really exercised that ability since I graduated college, unfortunately. My Japanese was far less along than that. But I built the language out of that just because I thought it would be cool, and I know that science fiction readers, fantasy readers like that stuff, because I do. And I basically, my instinct in determining what goes into the book is, do I like it personally? I see my audience is just me, right? I am sort of the template for the reader, and I just write stuff that I think I would like and hope that other people agree, and hope that I'm not so remarkable, that I can work as a representative for the audience. But as regards language generally, it shapes perception to an extent, right? We talk about like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right, and how cultures that have 10 words for blue see color differently than cultures that have no words for blue. And this is something that sort of comes out of my classics background. Oh, my headphones are going. But I might have to take them off here. But uh, in any case, is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay. It's the battery, so
Oh, I can't hear you though.
okay.
That's what I was afraid of. Hang on one second. I can fix
Yep.
this.
Yes, you can take some tea or coffee if you want while we're waiting.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
I hear you. Do you hear me?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My the batteries on my headphones died.
Yeah. I had the same this morning on the commuter train. So
So my apologies, everyone. But it shapes perceptions. I was saying in my classics background, right? The Greeks, for example, had no word for blue, and so this gave me thoughts about like the aliens, right? The aliens can't see red. I decided, right? And this, but it was the language that gave me the idea to do that in the first place. For example, right?
mhm.
And then that leads to questions about like our relationship as a species to certain colors, right? Because the fact that we can see red is actually quite unusual. Um, um, we develop the ability to see red in order to see fruit in trees, and one can sort of see the mythological connection there. I'm a Christian, fruit in trees, right? This is like deeply related to the Genesis account, and so um, there's a lot of rich symbolic background um, for this that comes out of the relationship between language, and then the relationship between language and biology and all of these things, and culture as well. But it also just gives sort of a superficial sense of depth to the universe as well, right? This perception, and this is something that, I mean, this is why Middle Earth is the best fantasy setting that's ever been made, right? Is it has this very deep linguistic depth to it because language informs our relationship with reality, period, right? And so that Tolkien's place names are all related very sensically, and in sort of an organic and evolutionary way makes Middle Earth feel deeper and more lived in. And I try to be very conscious of that in the relationship between character names. I try not to be, the fantasy writer who puts someone named Stephen next to somebody with 8 apostrophes in their name,
Mhm.
and so I try to worry very much about that in building the setting, and it's all sort of driven by the relationship with language. So if it's so I have like different rules for how I will name a character if they're imperial low class versus high class, and for how far they are from like the center of the empire, and they're not hard rules. You can make exceptions, right? but there are naming conventions, and I think about stuff like that a lot. I think too about giving things multiple names, because of course, people have different names for everything, right? We call Germany Germany, but the Germans call it Deutschland,
Mhm.
and a lot of writers don't do that.
Yeah.
Everything just has one name, uh, and so I try to think about all that stuff. Does that drive at the heart of the question, or is there?
No, no,
I feel like I might have missed something with that head.
no, that's great. I think, yeah, if you're into languages, Empire of Silence and SUNEATER is a great series. For me, it was very interesting also that you relate the languages to real languages. I didn't really grasp which languages, Latin, of course, I grasped, but also at least on paper, Hindi. It's the way you describe. I don't know the combination now, but I think there's some Hindi combination with one of the languages.
There is. I could speak to that a little bit. So this is actually my weak spot is that I'm not versed in all of the actual languages that some of these future languages are descended from, and it's a lot easier to make up an alien language and borrow some grammatical rules, right?
Mhm.
Cielsen's nouns are very Latin, their verbs are very Japanese, but the sounds are all made up. Than it is to build a future language that's the result of cross pollination between actual human languages. I am not Tolkien, and so that's a very difficult thing. So the conceit of the book is that it is a translation into English from a future language that does not exist, that is the result of sort of cross between Hindi and English. My Hindi is virtually non-existent,
Mm.
but I felt very strongly about the choice, and so the translation into standard English gimmick with the books has the result that the translator is using a bunch of Greek and Latin words for what are very antique sounding words that Hadrian is using in his language,
Mhm.
that are this sort of future Anglo-Hindi language that I don't speak.
Mhm.
Although I have enough of a grammar there that I could have that opening inscription. Although, and this is maybe a digression, I did not fully apprehend how the Devanagari work when I wrote that inscription that you showed. So I
Mhm.
had to rebuild the entire writing system,
Yeah.
because I did not do a good enough job the first time.
Mhm.
It was too English and not Hindi enough, and so I did some reworking in the new edition for the collector's edition that I put together, where
Okay.
it works more like it should. Let's say
Mhm.
it's still greatly simplified, uh, but this was I thought this would be interesting, and it also would help explain world building choices like the Hindu influence on the Chantry's faith, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so but I also like needed to bootstrap my own shortcomings, right? And so one thing I've thought about doing actually is when I write a standalone, I'm going to start writing standalone books in the universe after Hadrian's account is done, is doing a book that is not translated in the same way, and
Mhm.
so the language would have to all actually be in the language. So instead of saying centurion, I have to say a word that is derived from either the English or the Hindi instead of using the Greco-Roman gloss.
Mhm.
And that I think will be an interesting project when I do that. And my readers will be very confused and frustrated with me, and I will laugh. And the book will sell 5 copies because they're mad at me. But I think it will have been worth doing. So
Yeah, I think
um,
you should follow your heart. So that's the only thing you can do, I think, in life and writing. So yeah, we can come back to the language. I think maybe that was what drew me in. I'm not sure. I've learned I was adopted, so I won't talk so much about that here, but I was adopted to Sweden, went back to India, rediscovered my origin of faith, Hinduism. I'm grown up Christian, so Protestant.
ah,
And then I also learned the Marathi, which is very close to Hindi. So I've learned the Devanagari, the letters, and speak the language as well. Okay, so maybe that's why I was so curious on the language in your book, and also Tolkien, because when I was small, Elvish letters and the runes outside Moria and all these things attracted me also when I saw your.
Yeah, I'm the same way. When the church I went to when I was a kid had the word welcome written in like 50, 60 languages on one of the walls in the atrium, and I was always very taken with the Devanagari inscription as a kid. It's such a beautiful writing system that this sounds like it's a very trite reason to pick something, but I was just always just so taken with the alphabet itself that I was like, okay, if I'm going to build an alphabet for this setting, like which real alphabets do I like? And often you make artistic decisions for these very like trite reasons, but if you take them seriously, I hope at least you can get to very interesting and beautiful places. And I hope I know some people have said in reviews they feel like that was a very shallow move, and I hope that it isn't. But it's something I've tried to take more and more seriously as a decision as I've gone on. So.
We are going to continue to our last theme of the conversation, and that is spirituality and faith. People who follow my channel, or if you are new, if you're new, you don't know, but if you're not new, you know. This channel has the ambition, at least, to have a kind of spiritual perspective on fantasy and science fiction. As many of you know, I'm reading mythology, and I've read many epics in European epics, of course, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also Hindu epics like Mahabharata. Maybe this is a bit off topic, we will see. In the SUNEATER series, there is obviously a chantry, and there is what I presume is an established religion, and there are people who sometimes, of course, oppose the views of the chantry. If we put Hadrian into this context, is Hadrian on a, you don't need to say yes, so I'm not putting the words into your mouth. You can say no. Is he on a kind of spiritual journey, or how is spirituality and faith portrayed in your books?
Well, he certainly is. I don't know that he knows that he is, particularly in book one, but we all are ultimately on some sort of spiritual journey, whether or not we will admit it or think about it in those terms. I think that if we take God or a God out of our lives, inevitably something will take his place. Everyone worships something, I think, even if it's only themselves. And so Hadrian is on some sort of spiritual journey. We could speak to that, later maybe in the series. It's a little bit more concrete. But as far as faith in the world of SUNEATER, the predominant religion is that of the Terran Chantry, which was established cynically as a political project to sort of propagandize the imperial peasantry. This is, of course, a popular critique of all religion, which I think is a very foolish critique of all religion. But if we take the critique seriously in a science fiction setting, what does that look like, right? And I backed into it because when I wrote the book initially, I was an adherent of Richard Dawkins. I had been an atheist for about half my life due to some difficult sort of upbringing, not from my parents' side, but I lost my grandparents all in 1 year of unrelated causes. And that was very, very difficult. And it happened to be the year that I went from my very small Catholic school to my very large, very frightening public high school. And the total disintegration of the friend network that I'd gone to school with, because everybody went to different schools, coupled with this new environment, coupled with my family not falling apart, but if you lose your grandparents, right, then suddenly all the branches of your family, your aunts and uncles and their families that are all sort of orbiting your grandparents, all go in their own way. It's like the sun gets pulled out of the solar system, right? And everyone just goes on a tangent. Eventually, my family sort of came back together and found a new sort of epicenter to orbit around that sort of gap. But it was hard. It was a rough transition, and my Catholicism went with it for a very long time, and only really came back when I met my wife, who was in the process of converting when we were dating, and that had nothing to do with me, which was a very mysterious thing. And that happened too right after I had sold the original version of Empire of Silence. So I had this very radical sense change in myself with respect to religion between writing the book and having to edit it. And so I was left with this book I didn't really believe in anymore. So I needed to find a way to make an adjustment so that I wasn't stuck with something that I couldn't stand for the rest of the series. And so the distance between Hadrian, the narrator, the older Hadrian, and the younger Hadrian, with respect to his attitudes about religion, is largely a result of this changing me. So there really are two me's that have written that book, and so I had to sort of adjust it in revision, and to go from what is now to me a very shallow critique of religion to something that I hope is more interesting, and it gets more clarified as the series goes on. Hadrian is very opposed to the chantry. He is one of those well-read cynics I mentioned who doesn't believe in it, and he's right to not believe in it. It is obviously fake. It is obviously manipulative. It's what wrestling fans call kayfabe, right? It's an illusion designed to help manage the population. And it does more than that. Their primary job is to make sure, and this is a very real job, is to make sure that technological abuses don't happen, especially vis-a-vis artificial intelligence. This is partly an inheritance from Dune, but is also partly a necessary consequence of the fact that I want to tell a science fiction story about people and not about robots. So you have to get rid of robots somehow. But where Frank Herbert sort of shoved them out of the book completely, I sort of shoved them to the edges. We'll see more robots and things in the later books. But this ended up getting textured by the fact that a bunch of classic religions still exist. You'll see this if you read The Lesser Devil next, which is one of the novellas that's sort of chronologically next. We'll see that Christianity still exists in some form, somewhere in the universe, and there are other religions as well, and there are new religions that are sort of.
Now the sound disappeared, but maybe you can talk now. See if you.
Now?
Now I hear you. Yes.
Okay. But the Jadians, for example, are Zoroastrians. Their ruling class are descended from the Parsis, and I've always been fascinated by Zoroastrianism. Right, it's a mostly monotheistic religion that's very, very old and sort of co-evolved with Judaism and Christianity, and so I wanted to bring them into the story in some way, so they exist. There are forms of Buddhism that still exist. Hinduism proper Hinduism still exists alongside the sort of syncretic, goofy version that the Empire follows, which is also sort of a reversion to Greco-Roman paganism in a way. And of course, those have a common ancestor, right? A way back too. So there's some points of identity that are sort of drawn there. But there are also some future religions. One that started out as a bad pun that has kind of gotten away from me is there's a version of Buddhism that recognizes King Arthur as a bodhisattva, and it's because Arthur and Siddhartha kind of sound similar, and so someone on some planet got confused, and that was supposed to be a sort of one-off joke, but I kept coming up with interesting sort of mythological points of inflection there, and kept using it, and now I'm stuck with it. And so I've got this sort of strange Christian Buddhism fusion religion that's running around the universe, strongly identified with the character of King Arthur, which I think is wild and kind of interesting, and hopefully people don't think it's too crude. As you're noticing, these are mostly religions that are connected to ours, and that goes back to the sort of choice we're talking about. This is our future. It's just the clocks run a lot longer, and so what does that look like?
And I think that's it goes like a theme in your writing that you connect to experiences and history, religion, way of behavior that we know in our everyday on Earth. So it's not something completely different. So I used to have an hour or just above the hour mark for all my conversations. So I hope we can continue maybe later if it's possible, of course.
I'd love to.
Yeah. For you, Christopher, and also for the readers, I will continue to read the SUNEATER series, of course. I'm waiting for the book. It will come tomorrow, the Howling Dark, and there will come a review for the book on the channel. I would like to thank you very much, Christopher, for being here, and I really enjoyed our conversation together.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And all you subscribers, I will see you later. So thank you and bye-bye.